creeps in, this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays of lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out. Out. Brief candle. Life's but a walking shadow. A poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage. And then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing.
So, Death Note isn't very good. Or at least the anime isn't. I've had a patchy relationship with Death Note. I watched the anime way back in the day, but sort of lost interest after Misérables showed up. I tried reading the manga instead, and it didn't really grab me. Which, from what I've gathered, is a fairly common experience among people who got introduced to Death Note through the anime. I saw the first of the live-action movies, which I remember being somewhat bland. Live-action anime films are almost never good, but they often have their own kind of wonky charm, and the Death Note movie lacked even that, I found. Perhaps my opinion on it now would be different. I also saw the 2017 American adaptation of Death Note, which I think we can all agree was a grave mistake. I bring all this up to present my credentials of a sort. Present to you what I knew of Death Note before seeing Death Note, the musical. The musical is not so much a retelling of the story of Death Note as it is a version of it. In other words, it's an adaptation in the best of ways. It takes many of its familiar story beats and even whole scenes, but what causes it to differ so much from any of its source material is not only its specific medium as a musical, but its focus on the perspectives of the Shinigami. Rem and Ryuk take the role of both participant in and spectator to the narrative, and their role in the story is expanded as a result. Their reasoning, their philosophies, even their emotions are given much more space and weight than in the anime, or perhaps in any other adaptation of Death Note. Death Note the musical is far and above the best version of Death Note, not just in its execution, but because of its very medium. After having been blown away by the musical and having listened to nothing but the American concept album for a week, I decided to give the anime another go. And, well, the Death Note anime in many ways highlights what makes the story of Death Note so perfectly suited for a musical above all else. Because the thing about the Death Note anime is that it is insistent in its establishing of themes. Oh, the themes. These themes are central to the story of Death Note and to the motivation of its characters, and they are repeatedly established, bluntly so, but the anime never really uses its characters or its world to explore these themes. This is also why the themes have to be repeatedly established, because they are not explored. They are never really defined either, and so these themes end up being declared and abandoned over and over again. The most prominent theme, of course, is that of Seigi, justice. Also, Seigi is a homonym for sexual intercourse, but we'll get to the intensely gay nature of Death Note later on. Justice really is the main theme of Death Note, and it ties into and establishes many of its other themes, such as crime, honesty, punishment, and so on. But like the extremely broad and inherently ill-defined concept of justice, none of these other themes and subjects are really explored either. The anime insists on these themes being really very important and what it's all about, but it's not. Death Note is not about the nature of justice, its expressions or its consequences. Death Note is about two extremely privileged assholes trying to prove to each other that their big boy brain is the biggest big boy brain. It's not about the meaning or senselessness of death either, and the Shinigami only ever matter as a prop for the very important and super smart mind battle between two egotistical creeps, who really are very smart. You just have to trust us, even though their conclusions and theories are plucked out of thin air, and their rationale rarely ever explained. The anime's failure in confronting its themes may not so much be a failure caused by the show itself, as much as its medium. Animation, even more so than film, is a visual medium and seems to always shine most distinctly when it embraces this. Themes can certainly be explored visually, but that tends to lead to somewhat indirect methods, exploring more emotional subject matter. Millennium Actress is a wonderful example of this. Its style is unique to animation. No other medium could pull off a film like this, and it uses its medium to explore the emotional life of its protagonist throughout her entire lifetime. Its use of visual language makes it difficult to really explain why and how Millennium Actress is such a wonder, but when you watch it, you will feel it. But Death Note does not really explore emotional themes. Neither is it about the experiences of crime and punishment. It doesn't care about the feelings of the downtrodden, those driven to crime, the motivations of violent acts, the artificial construction of crime from a cultural and bureaucratic perspective. It's not interested in government policy, the inherent violence of laws and police, the structure of society and a world where the acquisition of money is sine qua non. And even if it did dive into any aspect of this broad subject, not much here lends itself to being explored through visual imagery. It's not that the Death Note anime doesn't imply this. Many of its most memorable moments use visual language to render mundane activities into exciting action scenes. The result, however, is generally goofier than it is exciting. But ultimately, these moments tend to be a bit shallow, with the tennis scene being perhaps the only standout instance in the show, marrying, as it does, the visual language of a tennis match with the internal struggles of reason and manipulation going through the minds of L and Light. But if the anime wanted to actually explore the meaning of justice, then perhaps what it needed was a Ghost in the Shell style moment of just plain dialogue, exploring the extremities of its themes. But the Ghost in the Shell movie is, well, a movie, and even its heavy philosophical dialogue moments rely on previous and concurrent visual language as context for what is being said. And for an episodic anime with 20-minute episodes, this approach does feel like a clunky solution at best. So what medium, then, is lacking? Why the musical, of course. Musicals are incredible at exploring themes. It's kind of their whole jam. There are the obvious ways they do this through song, but the best musicals also do this through its use of music. The channel Sideways is great if you want to learn more about the musical aspects of this. His many videos on leitmotif and various Sondheim musicals are especially recommended in this regard. But beyond their melodious subtleties, musicals are all about people brazenly singing their thoughts and feelings and drama. Of people using whatever style is needed to sing of the world and themselves what is too grand, too important, too complexly vital to ever be rendered meaningful by the laborious tedium of speech. Death Note the musical fully exploits this aspect unique to musicals. The musical starts with an ominous chorus of Kira, reminiscent of the opening of Sweeney Todd. But it is unclear whether this chorus is composed of the future victims of Kira or his followers. Perhaps both. A countdown occupies the stage. It is the time it takes for someone to die after their name is written in the note. The first thing we see is this countdown, before the note has even been introduced into the narrative. This story will not end well, and the fates are in motion. Tragedy lies ahead. It's all just a matter of time. The death of Yagami Light is already sealed when the timer reaches 0 and the musical truly begins. From this, we lead into a classroom scene, and right away we have Light getting up in arms over justice, and his moral indignation cannot help but overflow into song. This first song is entirely about defining the concept of justice. The students and their teacher chime in over and over with varying definitions of justice, and Light dismisses them all. None of it is true justice. What Light is seeking is an absolute justice. He is pursuing an ideal, discontent with the fact that ideals can never be fully realized. In an odd sort of way, he's a dangerous romantic. He wants his impossible ideal of justice made manifest as is. Any other version of it is false to him. His dismissal of the perspectives on justice declared by his teacher and fellow students quickly weeds out what justice means in this narrative. What matters is not justice, but what justice means to Light. And it is clear in this opening song that Light's justice is not really about justice or caring about other people, but an expression of his arrogance and sense of superiority. In a sense, Light's justice is all about him and the exceptional judgment and moral stature granted him by his self-appointed superior mind. And the song immediately following this is the introduction of the Shinigami. The first two songs establish and define everything the rest of the musical is about. The lyrics, the singing, the music, and the stage itself is employed to relate all of this. As Light sings of justice, he moves away from the rest of his class and seems to sing alone, but perhaps towards the audience itself, to a greater cause, a higher ideal, putting himself beyond his fellows. As Rem and Ryk appear opposite each other, through their song they move around the stage to eventually stand together, symbolizing the similarity of their perspectives. And look, all this isn't some radical, amazing thing for a musical to do. Quite frankly, it's just sort of basic, good musical practice. It can be done well and poorly, of course, but structurally it's nothing exceptional in this medium. But to the story of Death Note, even basic musical language and structure is incredibly impactful to the meaning and themes of the story. The perspectives of the Shinigami defines the meaning of this tale, and in the end, that turns out to be more true than is perhaps expected. The Shinigami's introductory song already does more for their role in the narrative and for their characterization than was ever the anime's intent, and it's far better for it. Because although the Shinigami are kind of ignored for the most part in the anime, they are what stands out most in it. Their designs are the most interesting, their nature the most intriguing, something it manages to impart even when almost completely ignoring them. Ryk, like all Shinigami in the anime, is kind of irrelevant. As already mentioned, he's a function and the inciting incident, but that's about it. He serves as comic relief at times, but he doesn't actually matter, which is a bit odd. I mean, I don't really care about the lore and world building in Death Note, that was never its thing, but Ryuk as a character is super interesting. Unlike other Shinigami who seem content in their drab realm, gambling and killing humans. The same few activities over and over again, Ryuk is dissatisfied. And it's not that he wants more out of existence, not that he wants to self-actualize in some way. He has no lofty desires. He's just bored, unbearably bored. Somehow, during his experience, he stole a Death Note from the King of Death, which is itself intriguing, and he uses it to amuse himself. He really is kind of a trickster character. His motivations are not inscrutable, they're just not as grand as we might expect from someone of his supernatural stature. But in the anime, he just sort of hangs around until he doesn't. For much of the show, he's not even present, having been abandoned to side characters or literally left forgotten in the woods. Rem doesn't fare much better. She is somehow even blander than Ryuk, even though she has a much more active part in the narrative and having much more complicated and emotionally driven motivations. But why she is loyal to Misa Misa is never made clear. She saw the Shinigami who loved Misa turn to dust to save her, and I guess because of that, Rem loves Misa now. But Rem's love does appear to be real. She's ready to perish over it, after all. But she also seeks to understand this love. It guides her actions, and yet Rem doesn't really understand it. She never denies its influence over her, and yet she puzzles over it. A personal mystery her cosmic nature has not equipped her to understand. And that's a super fascinating knot of emotions there. But the anime, of course, doesn't really dig into any of this, and like Ryuk, Rem's part in the narrative is largely one of function. Rem and Ryuk are narrative props in the anime, little more. MacGuffins and guns of Chekhov. In the musical, however, they are introduced in unison. Their introductory song a waltz between the two, where they sing of their separate ideals and philosophies. During this waltz, they also sing of human life itself as a dance, and they both agree it is a pitiful one, but for different reasons. Ryuk, all dressed in black, a bored trickster. He is bored of gambling all day and writing names in the notes all day. He believes human life a pathetic comedy. Rem, on the other hand, dressed all in white, is fascinated by humanity, a fascination colored by mourning. To Rem, human life is a tragedy. She sees goodness and potential in the human species and thinks it is sad that so many writhe upon the world, desperate for meaning and love, not knowing that nothing awaits them after death. There will be no reward for their actions, no punishment for their misdeeds, no succor in the hereafter. But Rem wonders, is perhaps not their small lives and their small kindness their greatest accomplishment? This waltz is one of the best numbers in the show. It's absolutely stunning, and it lays out the whole conflict of the rest of the musical. The story is not a push-pull of the existential philosophies of Rem and Ryuk, but a waltz between them. Both are correct in their own way, and each perspective makes sense of the other. Human life is not tragic alone, nor comic alone, but a tragicomedy, one made what it is by the other. In the cosmic scope, human life is truly pathetic, and there is nothing waiting for us after we die. We exist, and then we don't, and it's all so unbearably dull. There's no pomp to it, no glory, no greatness. We exist until we don't, and that is all. But this alone is not what makes it tragic. It's the human mind that turns it all into a tragedy. We throw ourselves about trying to give meaning to our lives, trying to find comfort and love and power, try to make the world a better place or a worse place, sometimes consciously, sometimes not. We can summon great art from somewhere we don't understand. We can invent and build and enlighten and learn and love, but then we die. And in time, everything that mattered to us will fade away too. In a way, to interpret this tragedy as a comedic one is perhaps the kindest, gentlest, and most sympathetic interpretation possible. Elle and Yagami Light end up being the vessels around which this waltz is played. But much like in the anime, the story largely pivots around Light. Elle is important to the story. The relationship between Elle and Light is really the central narrative in both the anime and the musical. But the musical, having added the context and expanded role of the Shinigami, is able to make much more out of this narrative. A narrative which is, frankly, kind of shallow in the anime. The combative relationship between Elle and Light, much like the Death Note itself, is an interesting premise that the anime doesn't really know what to do with. And after Elle dies, the anime just sort of plods along until the last 2 episodes or so. Even with Elle and Light, it wasn't sure what to do, and without Elle, the anime is completely at a loss. The whole Mellow and Near thing feels like just a whole lot of padding. Shoddy pantomimes of Elle that enliven the anime only when they make it wackier.
Missile? Oh!
あれはレーダーでは追えない方です。
ミサイルにノート。
The anime seems to think that what made Elle and Light so interesting was their mind battle, but really, all that was a lot of wank. It was their relationship that made it intriguing. The lies, the uncertain intent, how honest either of them really were. There is that famous old explanation of tension by Alfred Hitchcock. You have a room full of people talking, and then the room explodes. That isn't all that interesting. But if you show the audience the bomb, show it ticking down, you give the audience the knowledge of the bomb's existence and timer, then that conversation between the people at the table becomes incredibly tense and fascinating. Death Note pulls a similar trick with Elle and Light. Their various interactions, both direct and indirect, are intriguing because we, the audience, have the suspicions, plans, and thinking of both sides revealed to us. We know things the other characters don't, and that makes it tense and fun to see them trying to make sense of the limited information they know. Much of it being deception and lies, and so we know it takes but a minor slip-up on either side for it all to come tumbling down. But this too scarcely develops past a premise in the anime, and it doesn't seem to know what to do with it. It begins to drag pretty quickly as a result, and the fact that the audience knows so much of each side only reveals how wild and wonky the logic of Elle and Light really is. It's the anime's insistence on the mind battle being the important thing, and it is its neglect of the relationship aspect between Elle and Light that I think is the reason for the anime's stumbling in execution. If you haven't seen the anime and want to watch it, then honestly, just watch until episode 17 at the most, and then skip to the last 2 episodes, episode 36 and 37, and pretend Nier is Elle and the story is just better in every respect. Death Note was never really about Kira and changing the world. It was about Elle and Light and their strange antagonistic relationship. An antagonism between 2 people, each with their own hypocritical idea of justice, trying to one-up each other. That's kind of the thing about Death Note. It's not a philosophical show. It's not much of a character study. It's a terrible mystery show and an even worse drama. No, it's something else, intentionally or not. Death Note is one of many anime that I file away into the would have been good if it was gay folder, alongside Naruto and at least 50% of all anime ever made. I think it's pretty clear that the show is gay baiting pretty heavily, or rather, yaoi baiting. But it's a lot more than yaoi baiting. It's one kiss away from being an explicitly queer story, and Death Note is a queer story even without that. Not only is it made clear that Yagami Light doesn't like women, but what heterosexuality he does show is almost cringy in its performativity.
また表紙に騙された。いや、こういう時は僕だけが疑われ監視されていると考えて行動すべきだ。大丈夫。こういう事態に備えてこんな本までいろいろ準備してきたんだ。
Like all other expressions of upper middle class normality, Light is just as expert at mimicking heterosexuality. Light lives a life of pretend. The Death Note does seem to corrupt him the way absolute power is expected to, but the anime is pretty inconsistent with Light's character after he renounces the Death Note. With or without the Death Note, Light is never himself around people. He's always pretending to be the perfect, respectable, normal, upper middle class man. He seems to have plenty of opportunities to hook up with women, but never actually seems to, and is really kind of awkward with Misérables. The only way he knows how to interact with women is through manipulation and facade. You can watch the entirety of the anime and never really know who Light is, because he probably doesn't know himself. I don't think Death Note was written as a queer narrative, but intended or not, it is very much a story about repressed homosexuality and the expression of that repression into social facades of respectability. L could be read as being more comfortable with who he is. He knows he's an oddball. It's who he is, and he does not need the approval of society to allow him to be comfortable with himself. He does perhaps know that Light is uncomfortable with who he is. Perhaps L even knows of Light's true feelings. The theme of justice takes a different shape when viewed this way, being, as it is, an ideal pursued by Light as a justification for his own repression. His facade's given a higher purpose, an excuse to push it all down even further. And then of course we have the feet washing scene in L's last episode, which is straight out of yaoi. Even the sounds are yaoi sounds.
何をする龍崎。好きにしろよ。おい、すぐ慣れます。
This episode stands out in the anime for being so preposterously good in its use of visual language and mood, something the show hadn't done until now and won't do again until the final episode. Even if you don't think Death Note would have been better if it was an explicitly queer story, I hold that it's still undeniably a romance story. And if not a romance story, then a story of two dudes who are more or less the same, their only difference coming from their adherence, or lack thereof, to the performativity of social and cultural norms. What keeps these two from being the best of friends is because they are both kind of shitty assholes. I'm not saying it's a good romance story, but that even if considered as a heterosexual friendship story, it's still a bromance. And a bromance story is still a romance story. This thread of the story, the romance part, is barely pulled on by the musical, which in turn removes almost all of the queer narrative, which I honestly think is for the better. In the anime, it kind of dilutes the story and makes things a lot less focused, which isn't great in a show already frustrating with its general waywardness and lack of focus. Much of the anime's story beats in general are excised from the musical. Nier and Mellow are nowhere to be found. L sort of takes the place of Nier at the end, and almost everything between that dire end and the capture of Misérables is removed. On its own, this is a huge improvement, because the story then gets to be all about Yagami Light and L, and their pursuit of punitive justice, of violent solutions to their own internal problems. Without all the fluff muddling it, the story progresses much more sharply as we witness these two characters drive each other to a mutual downfall. And I know some of you shinobi tier weebs, a term I hear used with utmost affection, are going to say that L doesn't believe in a violent solution to justice, but L believes in punitive justice to the point of pursuing the death sentence for Kira, and just casually tortures people on a whim. So, frankly, exactly like Yagami Light, it does not matter what high-minded rhetoric L uses to prop up his horrid beliefs and actions. This is one of the strengths of the story of Death Note, I think, both as an anime and as a musical. L and Light can seem very different, and Light is, I think, undoubtedly the worst of the two, and yet their version of justice is remarkably similar. Their only difference may be their ability to execute their ideals. L lacks the selfish egotism of Light, but only in its appearance. L doesn't show all that much regard for people either, and least of all their emotions. L's justice is just as emotionless as Light's is. Neither of them really care about people. What they care about are their convictions and the rationalizations for their behavior. There is this wonderful part of the musical where Light meets Ryuk for the first time, and Light starts explaining himself, really putting on airs for his grander designs of justice, and how Ryuk chose him, and Ryuk goes into this wonderful song, all about mocking Light and his pitiful human mind, mocking Kira, the savior. Kira, Kira, nante yatsu marude kyuseishu, Kira, sono shoutai wa tada no gaki da. This song is great because it's somewhat of a repeat of the waltz between Ryuk and Rem, but with Light instead. And, unlike Rem, Light can't join into the waltz. He doesn't get it. He's kind of scared and pathetic looking because Light is not a Shinigami, and he doesn't understand how futile his life really is. In Light's mind, he is, after all, a very important person. もうじき罪を犯す人間はいなくなるはずだ。世界はもっといいところになる。僕がいい人間だと判断した人間しか生きられなくなる。そうなったらよ、この世界に悪党はお前しかいなくなるな。何言ってんだよ。本気だよ僕は。ずっと学年トップの優等生だ。だから僕を選んだんだろ。Top of his class, a grade A student, a real model citizen. Surely, Light is a super important guy. That his life is just as meaningless as everyone else's, his death just as pointless, is incomprehensible to someone of Light's character and position. It's just a lovely touch, another one of those ways that musicals can use song and dance and music to reverberate meaning through its story. What stands in opposition to these very smart and important big boys of justice is Misa. Although I'm not sure it's accurate to describe any of these characters as truly oppositional. Like the Shinigami, these characters too are in a waltz with each other. They're just not aware of it. Misa has a fair bit of agency in the anime, but she is perpetually bound and defined by her love and devotion to Yagami Light. I don't think this is actually that bad of a thing, because Misa's love and devotion is what makes her into a bit of a delightful wild card in the show. She often manages to do what all the big smart boys fail to, and her presence often highlights the heartlessness and pretensions of L and Light. She is also positioned as a fangirl in the anime and ties into its themes of cults and worship, themes vaguely brushed at in the anime and largely ignored in the musical. But in the anime, Misa sort of trails off eventually, and like the anime's Shinigami, she is frequently reduced to a narrative prop. The musical somewhat embraces the seeming shallowness of Misa's character, but like all other characters, she is made into so much more by the Shinigami. However, although Ryuk gives context to most everyone else in the show, Misa belongs wholly to Rem. The two form a tender bond. Rem even protects Misa from Ryuk's influence. Rem is, as Misa herself puts it, overprotective. The love between them is not romantic, but perhaps paternal. Rem doesn't act so much as a mother, however, but as a guardian angel. She doesn't want to control Misa, she just wants her to be alive and happy. And this song, good heavens, this song, when the two first meet.
熱い想いそれは幻だ自分騙す危険な罠だ
キラに会いたいの
海の深さまだ知らぬうちに愛の夢に絡め取られて愛などいつか消え去る残酷な夢
This song poses, indirectly, the musical's most important question. Is something pointless if it ends? Is love a cruel dream, cruel because it's an illusion, bound to end one day? Why do we humans consider things meaningless unless they last forever, when we all know nothing ever will? Why is non-existence so frightening to us? Why is irrelevance and being forgotten so terrible to the human mind? Are feelings illusions, love an illusion? If so, then what is real won't last forever anyway, so aren't the mountains and the rivers and flesh all illusion as well?
でも俺飽きちゃったんだ。また毎日毎日同じことの繰り返しだよ。ノートに名前を書いて人が死ぬの待つ。書いて待つ。書いて待つ。書いて待つ。書いて。退屈だよ。
The ending brings all of this home, and goodness gracious, what an ending it is. Everything has led up to this pathetic whimper. This big boy brain fight between these two assholes ends in both of them dying for no good reason at all. L is undone by Light having manipulated Rem into writing his name into her note according to his instructions. But Light, well, in a reversal to the anime, Light wins. He wins the big boy mind game. He can do whatever he likes now, and he will spend the rest of his days writing names in the Death Note and change the world doing so. Write names in the book, day in and day out. Write, wait, write, wait. A familiar tedium. The game is over. It's all done, and Ryuk writes Light's name in the book. This is how he dies.
全世界の神になるんだよ。死にたくない。僕には使命があるんだ。この世の正義は嫌だ。僕しかできない。僕は新世界の神。
All their high-minded rhetoric about justice and decency, all the misery they inflicted in pursuit of it, and here they are. They die alone in an abandoned warehouse, their last pleading whimpers meaning as much to the corrugated walls of their self-made tomb as their efforts and their lives ever did to a better world. The only one left here is Ryk. There's nothing glorious about death, nothing heroic or meaningful, just a whimper and then nothing.
何の意味もねえ。何にも残らねえ。こういうのが一番面白くねえんだよ。
As the final song tells it, we melt into the earth and our memory dissolves into a passing whisper on the wind. Like the leaves we grow, we fall and we vanish. Human life passes as the seasons. Our ideals, our love, or consciousness cannot undo the constant churning of time and the laws of nature. And as Ryk says it, this, death itself, is no fun at all. This is why he is so terribly bored. He has seen it pass over and over again, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. None of it matters. It's all predictable, inevitable, all so terribly dull. Death is the great equalizer. This applies not just to human life here, but to emotions and ideals and sorrows and joys. Everything ends. Material or immaterial, imagined or real, everything ends. Everything dies. Nothing lasts. unlike the anime, the musical does leave us with something of a moral and message, that death doesn't solve anything. You can't kill your way to a better world. I think a lot of people are drawn to the characters of Elle and Light because they like to see themselves in these characters. Each an archetype of the genius, each lionizing an emotionless rationality. A romanticized version of rationality removed from its sordid history and various interpretations. But neither character is really all that smart. They have close to no emotional understanding of others and even less regard for the emotional lives of others. It is a truly horrific myth that genius is cruel. We have no shortage of characters presented as being too smart to be kind. Tony Stark, Eddie Mora, Doctor Strange. There's a lot of these characters in the Marvel movies in general. Sherlock from Sherlock, House from House, and so on. But people seem to forget that all these supposed geniuses are absolutely miserable. And they are not miserable because they are smart. They're not tortured geniuses. They're just pricks and they don't care about people. They're selfish assholes preoccupied with proving to other people how smart they are. That's not genius. That's not even what being smart is. Being smart, as in highly educated and involved in tasks largely intellectual and rational in their capacity, is kind of a specialization, and only one of many varieties of intellect and intelligence. It's not for everyone, and the world would likely be a worse place if it were. And being smart still means doing the work. Science and academia isn't a bunch of people traversing their mind palace as they make intellectual gymnastics at their lessers. It's a lot of meticulous, tedious, boring work over a long period of time. And it is all built on the work already made by the thousands upon thousands of people that came before you. Even Light and Elle rely on others for their supposed genius. Light logs into the police database and Elle asks the police for various investigation and on-the-ground work. They both rely heavily on the meticulous, boring, tedious work done by the police force, the kind that doesn't lend itself to the drama of the screen. Genius is an appealing myth, even more so misunderstood genius. But throughout Death Note, who actually knows what life is all about? It's not Light, it's not his father, it's not Elle or Nier or Spicy Twink Mellow, the best husbandu. No, it's Misa Misa. Even in the anime, she's the only one who seems to enjoy being alive, and she's not a cop like everyone else. In her final song in the musical, she effectively declares her belief in the meaning of life. A song performed on a crucifix. Look, it's an anime musical, it's not all that subtle. In this song, she shows a considerable awareness of the meaninglessness of life, that even after she disappears, the days will still come and go. And because life is so fleeting and meaningless, love is everything. As she herself sings it, the value of life is decided by how much you love. Is that a bit simple? A bit naive? Perhaps. The world is not so easily fixed. Relationships are not so simple, no matter their nature. But, frankly, Elle and Light's ideals are no less naive or simplistic. Their rhetoric is more intellectual, it's fancier. But if you're going to live by an ideal, then at least Misa Misa embraces something good about humanity, along with the futility of life. Now, I am no pacifist. I can't pretend to be, overflowing as I am with guillotine nostalgia. But I'd rather have a world full of Misa Misa than a world with even a single Yagami Light in it, or even a single Elle. There is a much wider, much more complicated, and frankly absolutely fascinating discussion to be had about the nature of justice, of crime and punishment, who gets to judge, if anyone, and to what degree. But Death Note ain't it. It's not even really a good springboard for any such discussion. And the anime isn't great, but the musical is hardly perfect. It can be a bit clunky in places. The first half of the second act feels a bit hasty. It's a lot of just song after song without enough breathing room and connective tissue between them. And honestly, Elle doesn't have any very interesting songs. Narratively, that turns out to be okay, and the tennis scene is still here, and it's somehow better than it was in the anime. I do think it's possible to go into this musical not knowing anything about Death Note and still enjoy it, but I think it's far more enjoyable if you know at least a little bit about Death Note going in. As mentioned, I had only seen the first quarter or so of the anime before watching the musical, and that was enough for me to love it, and for many of the musical's more awkward parts to work well. Death Note, the musical, is fantastic. Go watch it right now or go watch it again. It's a great musical. Now then, play us out, criminologist from the Rocky Horror Picture Show.
And crawling on the planet's face, some insects called the human race, lost in time and lost in space.